And my slides are nowhere near as pretty as Netta. As you know, geeky scientists, we're all like, how did you make those slides?
Yeah.
It's my job to give you a very scientific presentation because it's about clinical trials. It's about the new things that are exciting on the horizon. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Jennifer Reynolds. I have actually been doing talks for the BC Lupus Pro meetings since 2008. So I don't even want to do the math as to how many times I've been up here, but I do see new faces, and so I thought I should introduce myself. So this is actually an update from the talk that Dr. Eugenia gave last year. As you'll discover if you've listened, but you're not expected to remember, it's very similar because research takes a long time. It's very slow. So you'll see some familiar stuff. Jeremiah and I were just at a really interesting meeting down in Albuquerque for the Lucent Clinical Investigators Network. It is a whole group of lupus research and clinical trials experts trying to figure out how to get more patients involved in lupus. And one of the key things we need to do better is to make people aware of clinical trials sooner and why they can be helpful for patients. So I'm going to spend just a few slides talking about why we do clinical trials and then get into the meat of what clinical trials we're currently doing in Vancouver. I'm leaving out all the clinical trials that they're doing all over the world. And talk a little bit about future options as we go through, if I have time. There we go. So you've heard actually a couple of times already this morning this list of medications, and even though it seems long, it actually is really short. So we have lots of patients with symptoms, and we're always trying to match up the right medications and minimize the harms going forward. So we want to control the disease with the minimum amount of immunosuppression, but we also don't want you to have ongoing active and autoimmune activity. So this is a slide that I give to the trainees all the time, but I thought you guys could handle it. My daughter said I had too many words in my slide, so I apologize. But so this is their guidelines from the European League Against Rheumatism and what they recommend for us in terms of treating lupus. So they divide lupus into mild, moderate, and severe because we're going to use less toxic medications, more toxic medications, and then the most toxic medications or strongest medications, because we need to control the immune system, because we need to shut down that fire so it doesn't cause damage and cause all the symptoms. So across the top in that red box are hydroxychloroquine and steroids. As rheumatologists, we love hydroxychloroquine. It's really well tolerated. It decreases your risk of heart disease. It decreases your risk of infections. It has good side effects when just about nothing else ever has good side effects. It's really, really well tolerated, apart from, unfortunately, a small group of people who have an allergic rash. And it's really, really safe for the first several years. Over decades, we worry more about accumulation of the medication, and we're really careful about monitoring for those side effects. But across the board, if you look at long-term data from all of these clinics that follow patients for a really long time, the patients that are on hydroxychloroquine live longer and have less damage. So if you want to live longer and have less damage, you should be on hydroxychloroquine, no matter how severe your disease is. And that green line goes across the top. Underneath it is the worst green line. It's steroids. So we hate steroids. P for poison, I think is how I explain it to people. But we don't have anything else that works as effectively as quickly. And so when the disease flares up, we need to put that fire down. We need to damp down the symptoms. And so we do use the steroids. But as Dr. Amiri said, we use the lowest dose we can for the least amount of time. Because again, those clinics that follow people for decades and decades, again and again, the people who are on steroids do worse. They have more damage. They have more harms. They do worse in the long run. If you looked at this slide over years, it used to be get down to 10. And then the next iteration, it was get down to 7.5. This one, it says get down to 5, and they finally added that clause and get off if possible, discontinue if possible. That's our goal in every single patient, is to get you off. But you'll see we still need to use it, unfortunately, quite frequently. And if those aren't working and you have mild disease, then we move to this purple box of methotrexate and azathioprine and mycophenolate. So no, we don't want to use them all in everybody, and that's really not our goal. But if your disease is still on fire, we need to get that inflammation down so there's no damage. And so those are medications, and I put those four and those three rather in purple and the other ones in purple at the bottom. These are medications that have been around for a long, long time. We are using them. Methotrexate was originally developed for cancer because we steal everything from cancer, azathioprine as well. We've had these for decades. We know what they do. We know what the harms are. They do work for a lot of patients, but as you'll talk about in clinical trials, they don't work for everybody. And then the next green box down are belimumab and anifrolumab. So they're in the guidelines. These are European guidelines. These aren't BC guidelines. So unfortunately in BC, we're really, really restricted in what we can give people based on what we can get covered. So access becomes a real issue. This is not recommendations based on what you can access. This is what in an ideal world you would use. But for us, we're really restricted in terms of what we can pay for. And the new medications are really, really expensive. So I have a few patients who can afford to pay out of pocket, but the vast majority of people cannot. So $20,000, $30,000 a year. It's not something you can do on an ongoing basis. I do think it's a good place for advocacy because I think BC does worse than everywhere else in the country. We do have access to belimumab, finally, but only for kidney disease and only through the BC renal program, despite the fact it's been out since 2011. It's about to come off patent and it may become something that we can access, but that's a terrible trajectory for patients in BC. Anifrolumab, fortunately, has been better. We do have access, again, very restricted. You have to fail a lot of these other older medications, but I do have access to anifrolumab medications. And then in the bottom, if you've got specifically kidney disease, or if you've got more aggressive disease, we are stealing from everyone as we always do. So cyclophosphamide, yes, labeled as a chemotherapy agent, but I would say that we use it probably in rheumatology as much as the oncologists do. Rituximab's another one that we've borrowed from the oncologists. Calcineurin inhibitors, we've borrowed from the transplant doctors, so they were the ones first using that to help prevent transplant rejection, but it works really well. So all of these are medications with a title, but the reason we're using them in lupus is because they work on the immune system. So we know the problems in lupus and we're learning more and more about those. And so we're targeting these pathways for.
Excuse me, before you leave that slide, or this one's fine too.
Yeah.
The hydroxychloroquine, you said, yes, across the board and whatever, but then you said longer term, it might cause other problems.
So longer term, your risk goes up. It's not that you're going to have them. And that's something that in medicine we talk about a lot of times, but I don't know that people really think about it. So your risk of having eye toxicity goes up if you've been on it longer term. But fortunately for us, the ophthalmologist's ability to test for the eye toxicity has gone up faster. And so they can test and see the toxicity long before you have symptoms of the disease. But I think people become complacent because they've been on the Plaquenil for 10 or 15 years and they're like, it's fine, it's not going to cause any problems. So I always make sure to remind everyone, it's like, no, it's the reverse. It's when you've been on it for 10 years that I want you to go see the ophthalmologist. And if your ophthalmologist isn't seeing you at least once a year, I get you a new ophthalmologist. Dr. Avinia is doing a really, really huge study across the province, looking at the incidence of the eye toxicity, because I think over the years, we've also learned how to dose it better. And so we decrease the risk by lowering the dose.
So the biggest risk is the eye issue, right?
That's the biggest one that we see. There's a few rare complications, but that's the major thing that we're monitoring for. This is the same kind of picture, and I'm not going to spend time on it for time, but the same drugs are used for kidneys, different order, different, more upfront. So we do clinical trials because usually we can use those, but sometimes that's not enough. We've exhausted those recommended drugs and we start borrowing from other areas to see if we can get something to work for an individual patient. And we'd love to see newer medications come through that are safer or that have a better long-term profile that we can use in our patients. And so we're trying to help the science because then it translates into better care for everybody going forward. I think I skipped over a slide, actually. Oh, I didn't. All right, so there's some challenges for it. I have a slide in there. We do clinical trials to improve care. But challenges, as you heard in pediatrics, patients in these trials they're trying to look for a really homogeneous group of people, but you can't be too well. So they want you to have active disease, which makes sense. If you're going to make something better, you have to have something to make better. But they're very, very restricted in how much disease you have to have. And you can't be too sick. So if you have brain involvement, your ability to understand the process of being in a clinical trial is decreased. And I have yet to see a clinical trial come through and agree to have patients with brain involvement, at least severe brain involvement. Lupus, fog, and things that we really struggle to treat wouldn't be an exclusion. This would be more like seizures and psychosis. Your brain really isn't functioning well enough for you to agree to be in a trial. Usually the kidney involvement is restricted. If it's a kidney trial, you have to have a certain amount of kidney disease. If it's a non-kidney trial, you can't have kidney disease. So sometimes that becomes a bit of an issue. As Netta mentioned, they almost always exclude patients with pregnancy who are pregnant or planning to become pregnant. That's because early on, especially, we don't know if it's safe. So we don't want to put that increased risk for mothers. So because we're immunosuppressing, they're going to exclude anybody who has an increased risk of infections or who has chronic infections like hepatitis and HIV. Sometimes they're looking at a specific immune pathway. And if you've already used medications that have changed that pathway, you can't go into the trial because we don't know how those two things are going to work together. But it means that there's overall a lot of things you have to have and a lot of things you can't have. And it becomes really, really challenging to get patients into clinical trials. So that was all that I was going to say about clinical trials. I'm happy there's really good support information that we are starting to be able to access through that Lupus Clinical Trial Network in terms of patients who've been through a trial who can talk to other patients about what it's like and what it means and what questions to ask and before you agree to it. If anyone's interested in our trial, we can go through that, but I had 20 minutes, so I had to cut out. So this is the clinical trial that Dr. Avina mentioned last year. It is a newer medication that actually is getting fast tracked for approval for Sjogren's disease. So Sjogren's doesn't have any biologics yet. This one is going to be the first, as far as I know. It is currently under trial for both lupus and for lupus nephritis, and we're doing both of those trials here. It works kind of like a combination of rituximab and belimumab. So rituximab, this is where you need a degree in immunology, and I have fancy immunology pictures, but you don't really have to know. So it's going to work by targeting the cells that make antibodies. So you both deplete them, so you have less circulating around, and you also kind of knock them out at the knees so they can't make as many antibodies they can create. So this medication in the earlier studies has shown to be quite effective. And so when we're looking at studies, we always look at that early data. We're trying to pick things that sound like they're going to be really helpful for lupus, and we want to be involved in and giving our patients the opportunity to participate. So I think slides. Yeah, so Sirius SLE1 is the clinical trial for general lupus. It is randomized, so patients get a flip of a coin as to which medication or not medication they're going to get. Double blind, they don't know and we don't know. So everyone gets a random white box and we don't know if it's medication or not. Parallel group, meaning they have more than one branch of what they're going to do. Placebo controlled. So placebos are nothing. So you have to compare the patients who get treatment with patients who aren't getting treatment. And as a physician, I struggle with that. This study is add-on therapy. So it's not that you don't get treated, you get treated, but you get treated with what we already would use. And this is just an add-on therapy for that. Multi-center phase 3. So phase 3 means that it's gone through 2 different phases already. They've tried it out in patients without disease. They've done some preliminary work in patients with disease. Now they're doing a big study trying to look and make sure that it's effective and safe. In particular, in this trial, there's 2 different regimens. So you can have the medication every 4 weeks by a needle or every 12 weeks. But because it's placebo controlled, you get an injection every 4 weeks. It's just a couple of them would be nothing. In addition to the standard of care therapy, we are closed to enrolling new patients. So, and actually this one is closed around the world. They've got enough patients enrolled. We currently have 2 patients who are in the study at our site. We had a 3rd patient, but she has possibly had placebo. She opted to come out of the trial. And unfortunately, because it's a really long trial, it takes a while for all the sites to recruit patients. Then you study them for 60 weeks, and then you have to do the analysis of the data. So we won't find out if it's working for a little while still. There is an extension study so that you can keep using the medication afterwards. And that's also something that we really look for when we're looking at clinical trials, because we don't want to start you on something that works and then say, okay, your job, bye-bye. We want to be able to continue that if it's working for you. So we have that option. The Sirius LN is basically the same study, but this time they're enrolling patients with really active lupus nephritis. So they need to have a biopsy proven within 6 months to get into the study. Again, 2 different doses, slightly longer. Their endpoints at 72 weeks. The design of the trial is not something that we have control over. This is something that a pharmaceutical company that's making this drug presents to us. They work with a lot of lupus specialists and clinical design specialists to design the trial. Running clinical trials takes hundreds of millions of dollars to do. And so that is all done and kind of presented to us when we agree to participate or not to participate. Again, we have 2 patients enrolled in our study. We are close to further recruitment for this trial. There are a few centers around the world that are still open and enrolling patients. That's that one. Okay. For all of these things, a really, really good source, if you're interested in learning more about a trial, is clinicaltrials.gov. It's put together through the US, but almost every study is also enrolling patients in the US. So there's a standard set of information that they have to put on that website, and it's mandated that it's kept up to date. So you can find out which centers are doing the trial, how many patients are still getting enrolled, if there's any preliminary data, things like that. Inclusion, exclusion criteria, if you're wondering if you're going to be in this trial, you can look there. It's the same information that we get. So CAR T-cell therapy, and I think Dr. Wong who kind of brought it up. Dr. Avinia mentioned it last year. This is probably the biggest buzz in lupus in decades. Ever? I don't know. It is a very promising looking, but early stage treatment, which basically involves resetting your immune system. So in lupus, we know that your immune system has started to inappropriately attack your own cells. It thinks that they're foreign and tries to get rid of them and causes inflammation. So the idea of CAR T therapy is to reset that immune system so that it's no longer recognizing your own cells as being the bad guys, and it just carries on with doing things normally. CAR T cell therapy has again been developed by the oncologists. It is currently a standard of care treatment for certain types of cancer. And so in BC, the BC Cancer Agency does have CAR T cell therapy as an option for some of their patients. In terms of lupus, as Dr. Wong mentioned, the first patient that was ever done was in 2021. So it's early stages. We don't know what's going to happen to patients over the decades of having this. And having cancer is not the same as having autoimmune disease. And cancer is, your abnormal cells, and if you wipe them out, the rest of your cells are fine. But in a patient with autoimmune disease, there's those underlying genetic risks. We haven't changed those. And so we really don't know what's going to happen in the longer term with this. But the initial data is really, really compelling. That's why people are so excited. The initial patients all have had really, really terrible lupus, and they have been mostly curative, at least in the early stages.
Excuse me, do you only have patients that have really severe conditions qualify for a program like this?
So for most of the patients that are in any clinical trial, like I said, They have to be sick enough, but they can't be too severe.
Right.
The exception for CAR T is they have to be really sick. There's no upper bar, because it is such an early stage treatment, and we'll get into what we're doing to people's immune system. So there's higher risks associated with the treatments. So we don't want to do that if you have mild disease, because we don't want to give you a ton of risk for, you know, a disease that maybe not ever going to cause really severe harm. It's shockingly expensive to do these. I think it's to the tune of $500,000 to treat one patient. So it is not something that is currently going to be offered for any wide group of patients. There's lots and lots of progress in terms of the science, in terms of different approaches that will start to bring some of those costs down. But I think we also really want to see the safety long-term data before we start thinking about it as a potential treatment for more patients. I didn't put the slide up because it's more, I tried not to put too many words on pages, but there are literally hundreds and hundreds of CAR T cell therapy trials ongoing for various disease options and using different immune targets and methodology. We therefore had to be really picky with what we were selecting as a trial we wanted to participate in. This is CAR T cell therapy in general. In this picture, it looks like a child, but it can be an adult. And this was actually taken from the oncology websites because they're artists are better than ours, and the process is the same. So as mentioned, the first thing you're going to do is what we call leukapheresis. You get an IV put in, they take out your cells, they get rid of the ones they don't want, they keep the T cells, and then they send those T cells off to be genetically engineered to, and I hate using army analogy, but you're basically making them, turning them into little soldiers that are going to attack your own B cells, because those are the ones that are causing all of the autoimmune disease. So they do that in a lab far away. It takes about 4 weeks at present, which is part of the issue, and they grow them up, so we have lots of them, and then they ship them back to us. We take, the patients come into the hospital actually, and then they're treated with medications that are chemotherapy that are designed to kind of shut down the whole immune system, which in itself comes with a lot of risks. And then they're given back these T cells.
Does this use either CRISPR or drugs?
This is a viral vector, but again, there's so many different technologies that are out there, different pathways and different targets. You know, sometimes they don't use patient cell, like your own cells, they'll use other types of cells, and then sometimes they won't do the depletion, but they'll just give you the T cells back. The field is going in about 1,000 directions at once. This is kind of the basics of what they're doing for oncology, and actually this is what we're doing with our clinical trial because there's more evidence for that. So this is just the words to say that. So it's called CAR T cell therapy because it is a chimeric antigen receptor. So that means that they're taking this T cell and giving it a certain receptor, and it's going to target a specific pathway of the immune system based on what we know about the immune dysregulation in lupus or the cancer for the cancer patients. I think we talked about all of that. So this is the blue box is what we talked about already and what they're going to do. The green box at the top is what happens in our lupus patients. So in the little arrow diagram, that's going to be the time as we go on. So initially, when you get the cell infusion is the up arrow, and then over time, those T cells actually grow in your own system and then eventually come down. Your own B cells go down and disappear. We can't measure them at all for a few months. And then when they come back as like new, brand new, we call them naive B cells. They don't know anything about, and in fact, we have to revaccinate you. You don't remember your childhood vaccinations. It's a reset of your B cells. In terms of lupus, what we see is that at that same time point, you have lots of circulating antibodies. If you've got kidney disease, you're spilling tons of protein in your urine. This SLE-DAI is the lupus disease activity index. It's really, really high. And then as time goes down, those all decrease, and complement is a protein your immune system is using up when you're making too much autoantibody and have too much disease activity, and it gradually goes back up to normal. So cartoon version of saying that patients go into remission. We can't measure autoantibodies. We can't measure abnormal immune pathways. Their proteinuria generally goes down, their disease activity goes down, and we're able to take them off of medication. It's amazing. The catch, and something that we needed to talk about with our patients, so we are, we'll skip that for time. We are doing this break-free SLE patient, SLE trial. We've had one patient we've recruited. And the one thing that we really had to stress with her is that it doesn't reverse damage. So if you have scarring in your kidneys because you've had 3 episodes of lupus nephritis and it always causes a little bit of scarring, we're not going to be, scar is there. Scar is just there. We can't bring that back. So we're going to get rid of the lupus that's active now. We're hopefully getting rid of lupus activity as it goes forward in the future, but we aren't going back in time. We're not reversing the damage that's already there. So I think separating out how much is damaged from how much is activity is sometimes a bit challenging, but for most of these patients, damage begets damage. So if they're already having some amount of damage in their system, that's worrisome that they're going to have more going forward. Most of the patients that have been treated early on or in their 20s or 30s, they have decades more time to accumulate damage if their disease isn't put into better control.
So, sorry, the ideal then would be to treat it as early, like to introduce this as early as possible, like in.
If you have active bad disease, because there's also a huge spectrum of patients. This isn't an easy treatment to go through. There's lots of risks and complications with doing all of this treatment to a person. If you're going to have mild disease and Plaquenil is going to control your disease, your long-term life expectancy, the risks for you, you're way better off to stay on Plaquenil. And even if you have moderate disease, there's newer treatments. So anifrolumab and Benlysta in particular, patients don't have long-term complications. It's a biologic and we think about it as being really potent, but in fact, it is really well tolerated. You would be way better off to be on Benlysta for 20 or 30 or 80 years than to be in a CAR T-cell therapy. But for those patients where we have really severe disease, and especially if they're not responding to what we currently have, because we know what they're going to have, you know, side effect wise from those, then it's amazing to have this as an option.
Do you see that in children though, like severe lupus?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Stephanie in the yard clinic loves to send me all of their graduates. My worst lupus patients, hands down, are all children that have children onset disease, and sometimes young adult onset disease. But if you've managed to get through 40 or 50 years of your life before you start developing symptoms, in general, your immune system has kind of managed itself for quite a lot of times, and we generally see less. There's no 100%, but that's a general rule. So yes, our first patient has consented. We're going through the process. You can imagine that there's a ton of pre-work to do, then the actual process, and then the follow-up for this study. So they're looking at an outcome at 6 months, but they're already planning for following patients for 5 years. Obviously, we're going to follow patients forever. We do have an option to enroll a couple of more patients where we're kind of competitive with a multi-center worldwide trial. So depending on how quickly other centers enroll, they may cut us off. But we are very excited about getting some of these poor patients enrolled. Saphnelo or anifrolumab, I talked about it. It's already in green bar. Why the heck are we doing a clinical trial? Part of that is access. So we can do a clinical trial so I can get more access for patients here. So we're doing a clinical trial. It's appealing because this is a drug that's now been used. So when you think about clinical trials, they're really excited if they get a few hundred patients into a clinical trial. As soon as it's licensed for use, all of a sudden you get thousands and thousands of patients using it. So your safety, your reassurance that this is going to work, it just goes up immensely. I mean, if you think of vaccinations, they're going out into billions of people. So it doesn't take very long before you get a lot of safety information. You just can't get any clinical trial data. So anifrolumab has been licensed and available, and the US seems to get a lot more access for a lot of their patients. There's already thousands of patients who have had anifrolumab. So we've become more and more comfortable with using it. We just don't have as good access here because of the challenges with the government. And so I'm happy to do this trial because I would love to use more of it. I would love to use it earlier for patients. It interferes with viral replication. So the one thing we watch with this is already lupus patients have a difficulty in managing viruses. It's part and parcel with having, you know, the types of defects that you have in your immune system that cause the autoimmunity are in similar pathways in how to manage viruses. So we know that, for example, there's an increased risk of cervical cancer in women because of HPV virus, human papillomavirus, causing more symptoms. We know that if you get an influenza virus, so an influenza infection, that it can potentially trigger off a flare of your disease. There's lots of smoke and not 100% conclusions, but that things like mononucleosis or EBV virus can be a potential trigger in somebody who's already susceptible for having lupus. So when we're interfering with these pathways, one of the things we worried about initially was viral infections. The one that's really come out as being a concern is shingles or reactivation of that herpes virus. And so everybody who goes on to anifrolumab needs to have a shingles vaccine to just help prevent that. In fact, everybody who has lupus should probably have the shingles vaccine because the increased risk of shingles is 10 times normal or something else really high. So yeah, currently, if you have active lupus despite prednisone of 10 milligrams a day and you're on hydroxychloroquine and an immunosuppressant, then that could potentially argue to get you. Those criteria are likely to change because they don't make a lot of sense. I don't want to put anyone on 10 milligrams of prednisone and wait for them to have active disease despite that. That's not a good long-term plan. So if I can get it easier and faster through the sunflower trial, I will do that. We're not yet up and running on this, so we're not enrolling patients yet, but the idea is early. So patients are allowed to have had hydroxychloroquine. They can have some steroids, though, but don't need to have had any steroids whatsoever, and we can just first line move on to anifrolumab for them. So particularly this medication has been shown to be really effective for skin disease. It has some lovely data looking at things that we don't normally measure. So patient complaints of fatigue and brain fog and pain generalized that we can't necessarily measure in terms of all of our immune activity markers have been shown to improve with this medication as well. So I'm hoping that we'll be able to get some patients here locally onto this medication. I'm sure I am over time, and so I'm happy to answer questions afterwards.